College football nerds here talking top 10 and kind of a state of college football, where we're at after this absolutely nutty weekend. Bunch of top 10 plus number 11 going down, and we're going to talk about it a little bit. Josh is here with me. I don't know what his schedule is going to be like as we go into the weeks after this one, given that he's had a little bit of a situation in his family life. I'll let him talk about it for a minute, but we're going to take advantage of him while we have him today. And another quick note, I think I am doing a hit on RJ Young's show talking Texas and Oklahoma that should come out at some point this week. So take a look for that as well on RJ Young's channel on YouTube. And with that, Josh, I'll turn it over to you. You can talk for a minute and then give us your top 10.
Yeah, so first, guys, just to sort of let you know what's going on with me. My wife is pregnant with our first child, and unfortunately, she had a major complication with her pregnancy and was hospitalized the middle of last week. So, people wondering if we were going to do a third preview and where we went, kind of the issue. I've been in the hospital actually the last few days, my first time home in a number of days. The mom and the baby are well, but they will be in the hospital probably for 6 or 7 weeks, God willing. So, keep us in your prayers if you would. The best case scenario for us is no news that my wife stays pregnant. She stays in the hospital and then we can deliver closer to a normal due date. Yeah, so that's what's going on with me. And again, all prayers are appreciated. And I know this is a good community, so I appreciate everybody that's a part of it. With that, here's my top 10. This week, no one wanted to be ranked in our top 10 except for the top two teams. That would be Ohio State and Texas. Yes, I had Ohio State jump Texas. No, I can't give you a straight justification for why one or the other is ahead of each other. They both got to get in your schedules, and you both got to play somebody of a little more merit for me to be able to suss it out. But I will say both those teams, defensively, they've been fantastic. Offensively, they've been fantastic. Can't say that about the rest of college football to this point in every single game. So you guys are kind of in a tier of your own. Number 3 through number 10 are the hard ones. I have currently Oregon, then Georgia, then Penn State, then Alabama, then Miami, then Tennessee, then Ole Miss, then Clemson. And I'm sure people are gnashing their teeth at all kinds in that list. But let's be honest, if you're in the rest of the list, you have done something bad. You're on the naughty list, and you have a reason to be ranked lower than you are. It's just that everybody else has screwed up at least as bad as you have. So, Daniel, that's my list. I'll let you give yours, and then maybe we can sort of recap where we think things are, why these games ended up the way they are, and sort of what we see with all these teams.
All right, for mine, I have Ohio State, Texas, Oregon, Georgia at number 4, Penn State at number 5, Alabama with you at number 6, Miami at number 7, 8 I've got Clemson, 9 Ole Miss, and 10 I have Iowa State. I want to start with Bama because I told somebody on Twitter that I wasn't going to rank Alabama in my top 10. And I think that a lot of people, there's two things about that. One, a lot of people want a quick and really severe overreaction when a good team loses. So one of the teams at the top loses, they want that team to be dumped. I thought Alabama should have been dumped. The problem is a lot of people that would be there in that 5 to 9 spot lost as well. Michigan lost, USC lost, Tennessee lost to Arkansas. And then Miami should have lost to Cal. So, Josh, I actually didn't want to put Alabama in my top 10 at all. But the way this sort of night played out, here's my key thing, and this is what I'm going to turn it over to you with. I've got Alabama at 6. You've got Alabama at 6. My issue is, one, I don't think any of the teams behind Alabama, it's reasonable to say they would be undefeated with Alabama's schedule. And 2, I don't think any of the teams that we have behind Alabama would be favored over Alabama either. So before people start calling us homers, I don't see a Miami or an Ole Miss or a Clemson being favored over Alabama on a neutral field.
Yeah, I expect there's probably going to be backlash. A lot of it is going to probably be from fans of, especially like the Big Ten. People want to see Alabama lose. It's the evil empire of college football. They've lost a game. Hey, we can finally knock them off, put them out of the playoffs. First thing I'm going to lead with, Daniel, this is the point we've made forever, that expansion of the playoffs only help the haves. because it makes it really hard for Alabama to not make the playoffs. If this was a normal 14 year that we had in the past, Ohio State, Texas, and then a mismatch of teams would be all vying for those third and fourth spots. And so you'd have a very good chance of having a different national champion than we've had in the past few years, where it's been, SEC team after SEC team with one or two others sprinkled in, bookended by Big Ten, a couple ACCs just all coming, Clemson and Florida State. We could have had a pretty different playoff structure. And instead, you're going to get those SEC teams thrown back in there because they're going to be top 12. Quite frankly, because they need to be. They are top 12 teams. When you look at Georgia, Penn State, Alabama, Miami, Tennessee, Ole Miss, Clemson, they all have the same problem, which is if you gave them Georgia's schedule or Alabama's schedule, it's hard for me to say any of them would be better than 4-1. Like, I don't think Penn State is beating Georgia right now. I don't think I would have Penn State favored to beat Alabama right now. Tennessee actually has lost. Ole Miss has lost. Clemson lost to Georgia, so I can say for sure if they have Alabama's schedule, they're not going to beat Georgia. Miami, their schedule is so much easier than everyone else's. It just is. And Miami fans, I think, sometimes are the most heated in our comments. You need to accept it. Your schedule is easy. You should have lost to a Virginia Tech team that did lose to Vanderbilt. And you can say that's a one-off, but then you turned around and had the same kind of performance again this past week. I have no reason to think that if Miami played Vanderbilt back-to-back that they wouldn't lose one or both of those games. And I have no reason to think that Miami could beat Georgia right now. I understand Miami has a lot of defensive injuries, but look, let's be real. Alabama has injuries. Georgia has injuries. All these teams are a little beat up. That's the reality, especially when you're the big dog. Things happen. You lose key players. I get the situation at Miami, but these haven't been great performances. Tennessee losing to Arkansas. And let me say one other thing too, Daniel. I mean, you can say, like, people are going to laugh and say, well, you lost to Vandy. It's Vandy. Right now, Arkansas in our metrics is 55th. Vanderbilt 62nd. There's not a huge gap between these teams. And so when you talk wins and losses, again, it comes down to this impossible subjective thing of trying to say what is more important, a good win or having taken a bad loss. Alabama has the best win in the country and the worst loss of the elites, arguably, on either side. How do those balance out? And when you look at, say, Tennessee has a loss that is darn near as bad as Alabama's, but their win is way better than anything Tennessee's accomplished. There's zero doubt in my mind that Georgia is a much better team than Tennessee right now. Or much better team, than Oklahoma. Debatable whether they're better than Tennessee. That's a slip of the tongue. But better than Oklahoma. And so you kind of end up in this mishmash. Miami fans probably the most upset because they're undefeated. And they're, that to me is the problem, Daniel, and I'm sure you'll want to have a little mini rant on this. I hate when people just say, oh, we're undefeated, we have to be ranked higher. Okay? Schedules in college football, they're not just not equal, they're not remotely equal. And we always say we try to approach it from the perspective of if you traded schedules, how would you have done from each other's schedules? That's the way I do my rankings. Early on, week 1, 2, 3, it has to be some sort of power projection because the schedules are so weak, there's no other choice. At this point, I can start actually looking at played schedules. And I just don't buy that Miami would necessarily be any better. In fact, I would think more likely than not they wouldn't because they haven't looked like a team on the same par. Their schedule's almost like a G5 schedule. And Daniel, I don't know if you have thoughts on this. Some of these schedules outside the SEC and Big Ten are, in my opinion, effectively G5 schedules. It's not remotely close, and it makes ranking teams extremely difficult.
Yeah, I mean, looking at Miami, and this is the one that, like, I frankly didn't even struggle that much with it. Like, I think there's a better argument for a team like Iowa State or Ole Miss or Tennessee being ranked ahead of Alabama than Miami at this point, because what did we do back in the four-team playoff era? We had to scrutinize schedules where you didn't play nobody. Clemson was a team that played in a weak ACC and didn't have really good ranked teams or any ranked teams on their schedule, I think 1 or 2 of those years, but they dump trucked people. And so that's my issue with Miami is you've got back-to-back wins over not top 50 teams. And like you said, one of these teams actually lost to Vanderbilt. The California game was another game also that late they had to have some help from the refs. And if you want to say the targeting call was the right call, that's fine. On their game-winning touchdown pass with 30 seconds left on the clock, They had 2 linemen 5 yards upfield. 2. So, and that didn't get called. So, yes, they got help from the refs. Miami has played poorly in back-to-back weeks, and they have what I think by the end of the year will be a schedule that doesn't have a top 50 team on it, which is unheard of. The best team on their schedule right now is Florida. And I know y'all think that's crazy. Louisville's overrated. They're not even a top 25 team anymore. Syracuse just lost or barely beat UNLV. Wake's terrible. Duke's overrated. So I think that Florida might end up being the best team on their schedule, which says a lot. And then looking at some of these other teams, like, for me, Tennessee is still in there and maybe has an argument ahead of Bama. But like you said, I don't think Oklahoma, who barely beat Houston, who really struggled with Tulane, is nearly as good as Georgia. So it's like, what do you do there? But my one that I have a quibble with, I think it's either the AP or the coaches poll has Penn State ahead of Georgia. And to me, that is lazy because not a single soul in the world, in my opinion, would take Penn State over Georgia on a neutral field right now. Penn State's playing ugly football. They are the same team they've always been. They cannot dominate these mid-level, mediocre teams, but we've got them at 4 by default. And having Penn State and Oregon at 3 and 4 in the AP poll shows you just how hard it is to fill out a top 25 or a top 10 right now because there's not that many good teams. Okay, with all that, Josh, talk a little bit about Texas and Ohio State. I feel like our placement of them and flip-flopping them is for similar reasons, but we've both got Ohio State at the top this week, which is tough because they haven't played anybody either. I don't think I was very good. But they've done what Miami hasn't, and they've handled their business.
I mean, and that's sort of the simple answer to it, right? I mean, Iowa, that was a game that was kind of a slow start for Ohio State. Ohio State came out 7-0 at the half, and then blew them out in the third quarter. And I have to give Ohio State all the credit for that because they're doing things others haven't. But I think the thing that flies under the radar with this is Texas hasn't allowed more than 13 points in a game, right? Ohio State hasn't allowed more than 14 points in a game yet. And the offense at Ohio State just looks nigh unstoppable when it's rolling. And, you and I maybe differ a little bit. I don't think Will Howard is an elite quarterback. I don't think you do either. I maybe think slightly less of him than you do. I think the pieces at Ohio State are so good around him that he just has to be merely good. And I think he is good. And he's very experienced. He gets the ball out. He's pretty mobile. He misses some throws. He doesn't always read things right. He can get a little bit shell-shocked. In the start of the Iowa game, he wasn't great. But, the misconception I had a couple weeks ago when I had first watched the Ohio State-Marshall game was it almost felt like to me, like watching it initially off the corner of my eye, like the Marshall offensive line or the Ohio State offensive line versus Marshall wasn't winning. And I realized when I went back and rewatched it, no, the line was doing great. It was just a matter of could Ohio State click enough to get the ball out and to the line of scrimmage, past the line of scrimmage, and get it in somebody's hands to where they could make a play. And every time that happened, it was big. And Jeremiah Smith is absolutely phenomenal. The running back core, Judkins and Henderson are phenomenal backs. And then you get guys like Egbuka that are now almost a secondary role. I mean, I feel like at this point, Smith is the bigger receiver, the better receiver. And number 2 would be an absolute number 1 receiver in most teams. It's just a phenomenal set of skill talent. And Texas, we could go through the list, but they're pretty much just as deep, maybe the exception at running back, which might actually catch up to them at some point. But given their offensive line at Texas, they're going to have a run game anyway, and they've got a really good experienced quarterback and clearly a very good backup. So these two teams are complete teams in a way that we haven't seen from anyone else. We've seen teams with great defenses. We've seen teams with great offenses. We haven't seen teams that have both of those, put them together, and have done so every week, even against bad competition. And so that's why I have them where they do. And Daniel, I want to turn this discussion a little bit because I want to talk about parity. Okay? The thing that I keep seeing, and I know you tweeted about this, I'm going to let you take the blame for all the bad tweets over the last 4 days because I've been, dealing with my own stuff. If there were some good tweets, those were mine that I squeezed in. All the bad ones were Daniel's. That's clearly how everything worked. The NIL stuff that you mentioned, and because partly we've been talking about it, is that people are saying, oh, well, NIL and the transfer portal have created parity, and that's why this is happening. I don't buy it. because of the teams that are winning and losing because of how they're losing. In our metrics, which remember our 1 through 133 pointedly is an on-field only power ranking. Power ranking based on only how you've played this year on the field against your competition. There are plenty of wonkiness factors to it. Right now it has Army number 3, I think. And I think we may end up rerunning the data again tonight when we get some more data in from our provider from late games. But it has no preconceived notion of how good these teams are. It doesn't use recruiting rankings. It doesn't use past year's results. It has Ohio State number 1, Texas number 2, by a huge margin, by the way. We rank it in terms of wins and losses if you played the rest of the schedule, like the rest of college football, okay? Ohio State, it has with 2.3 losses, and Texas 3.8 losses projected. And that is including, right, if it's an even split between you and another team, it counts it as half a loss, half a win. So it's saying these teams will almost never lose to anyone in college football ever. Once you hit team number 3, the number of losses jumps up to 12. Alabama's at 12.5. Oregon's at 14. You drop down even further. And the thing is, by the time you get to like Vanderbilt, they're 70 and 63. It's like this ranking system we have says Vanderbilt is a huge gap from Alabama from a quality perspective. It is saying to us right now, there is no real way to objectively say that somehow through the transfer portal or NIL that Vanderbilt is a particularly close team to Alabama. The one tweet I did sound out the other day was I went back and tried to look at this while I was sitting in the hospital actually watching football all day, and just try to figure out when was the last time we had an upset of a non-top 50 team over an elite. Elite being somewhere around the top 3 to 5 teams. The number changes about every year. But I have said for years and years, non-top 50 teams never beat elite teams. It does not happen, and that's why we've talked a lot about with scheduling. It doesn't matter if you play the 80th best FBS team or you play an FCS team or the 130th best FCS team. If you're a national title contender, you win every one of those games by 30 points pretty much no matter what every time. There were no examples of non-top 50s beating elites since really the 2011 Iowa State win over Oklahoma State. It's really the last example of that. The closest were Virginia Tech over Ohio State, 2014. I think it was 2018 when Purdue beat Ohio State. That's off the top of my head. Those were teams at the top 40 range, even. Purdue was like the 40th best team in the country, even then. And that was a massive upset. So for Vanderbilt, who was in our metrics were 77th, and I'm looking it up right now. So let's look in Brian Fremeau. Vanderbilt is currently ranked in FEI 82nd in the country. Alabama is 3rd. Vanderbilt shouldn't stay with Alabama. They are a 3, 4, 5 touchdown worse team today after having played the game on paper than Alabama. So how did that happen? And I think some of it is the transfer portal and that Vanderbilt got a good quarterback, but that's why they're 82nd and not 110th, which is what they had been the past few years. The defense at Vanderbilt's still bad. They're just bad. I think the problem, Daniel, is scheme and changes in the nature of the sport. We've shortened the clock. So first off, if Alabama had an extra couple minutes, Alabama probably would have won that game. If they'd had an extra 3 possessions in that game, if they'd gone 2-3 possessions longer, I think Alabama wins the game. They were clawing back. Vanderbilt managed to bleed out the clock. Sure, Alabama was struggling to stop them, but they were scoring late in that game enough that I think they would have won. 2, I think scheme changes have had a huge impact. So we've talked a lot about the offseason that college football is shifting defensively to this idea of over-aggressive, zone-based defenses. Lots of cover 1, lots of cover 0, lots of disguising things at the line of scrimmage. Michigan's run it. Alabama runs it. Georgia's run variations of it. And what you see with all these schemes in general is they can completely shut you down. But a lot of these teams, too, are having games where they have massive hiccups. As teams shift to these modern defenses, which are on average better, the problem is they are very aggressive. When you don't run man coverage, when you run zone, if a quarterback is on, they can always pick apart zone. That's the problem with zone. If your team is being aggressive and they're not getting penetration, if they're shooting gaps and missing guys, you're going to give up big chunk plays. We talked about in the Alabama preview. I talked extensively about how Alabama's scheme was going to be much more susceptible to chunk run plays than it had been previously under the two-gap scheme. And what I saw from Alabama in particular, and I'll call this out, when I went back and rewatched it, I've seen people on Twitter talk about, oh, you can't run a 4-2-5. That's crap. Alabama's been a 4-2-5 team for 10 years. The nickel was Saban's base defense. The scheme differed. The second half of that game, when I went back and watched the highlight tape, I saw 3 defensive linemen and 2 offensive outside linebackers on the field on the line of scrimmage quite often. They were playing with 3, 4, 5 men on the line of scrimmage. They were playing with 3 down linemen. They experimented with 3, 4 D linemen. I don't know if they touched 4 with a 5th linebacker, but they were experimenting with 5-man fronts, and they still could not get it done because it's not their scheme. And when they penetrated Vanderbilt's read option stuff, I think this is going to be a problem for a lot of teams. Is we're going to see this schematic shift where old stuff that hadn't worked for years is going to start working because all this over aggression. When you play a veer-based, option-based attack, it's very much assignment-driven. It's space-driven. And Vanderbilt, because they were so good at making all the right reads pretty much the entire time, didn't miss hardly any makeable throws in that game. What it did is it took Alabama's aggression and punished them for it. They were never in the right place at the right time. They would tackle 3 guys, but the 4th guy would have the ball, and he'd be the one 12 yards downfield. And combine that with a power run, which is really the thing that the zone is the weakest at. And Alabama, again, they're almost more of a 3-3-5 than a 4-2-5 in this current scheme. But regardless, they really punished Alabama in an interesting way. But I think something we're seeing across the board in college football is with these aggressive schemes, they are boom or bust. And they may be more boom or bust, may mean lower scoring. It may mean you can take a Tennessee and you can just shut them down. But it also may mean that you are Miami and you're playing Cal and you get run defensively. And so the very same reason that everybody runs this so Arkansas can shut down Tennessee, so Georgia and Alabama may shut down Tennessee this year, may also be the reason that Tennessee may put up 60 on one of them. Because it's the only way to shut them down. But it also means 1 out of 4 times you're going to blow up a game. And you combine that with a 12-team playoff and mulligans and everything else, I think that's actually the driver. The shortened clock, the changes in scheme, and I think the NIL has put some people just on the doorstep of being competitive. But the teams winning these games, long and short, they're not the Louisvilles that have gotten close. It's not Miami that's gotten close. It's not Florida State who had a ton of transfers. It's Vanderbilt who has transfers and is just barely good enough, but running a particular scheme against a particular scheme in the right way. Arkansas, not even a transfer-laden team, really. I mean, they got a transfer quarterback, but they lost as much as they gained in the portal. They win that game. How'd they do it? Schemes. The new schemes are able to shut down offenses. We have said for years and years, games under 24 points are far more likely to be upsets. We said for years that elites can put up 40-plus at will. That's not happening. I'll end the rant, Daniel, with that, but that to me is what's going on in college football right now. I think it's not about parity. It's about volatility. Anyone can win on every given week, but I don't think these teams are actually closer in quality. It's just much more likely for someone to show up in a given week and play like crap, and it's much more likely for an Alabama to come out or a Georgia to come out next week, and they may beat one of these teams by 70 points. It's just every game is going to be a lot more variable, I think.
Yeah, and look, if the transfer portal was creating a lot of parity, then Alabama would be competing with Vanderbilt for the same players, and they're not. Alabama sent a bunch of their backups to Florida State, and Florida State's terrible. Like they leverage the transfer portal quite heavily, and they're one of the worst teams in the country. So, until we see an SMU or a UCLA or a TCU up there consistently, not just a bunch of them consistently competing for the same players versus Alabama, Texas, Ohio State, then it's pretty clear that the transfer portal is not doing that. And what we're still seeing is Alabama, Texas, Ohio State is poaching the best players from lesser programs. Or they're doing horizontal moves for more money or better situation. Like Caleb Downs going to Ohio State is a great win for Ohio State, but Caleb Downs wasn't choosing between Ohio State and, Tennessee Tech. It's not creating parity the way that people are saying. And over time, like all of this is new, but over time what we're going to see is what we've been seeing in that they're taking a lot of these players that are like the one shining star on a mediocre team and they're poaching them. And, I don't think it's going to create this great land of equity that people think they're going to get. It's still going to be the haves and the have-nots. I think that's pretty clear. All right, Josh, anything else you want to get in
Just
before we wrap this one up?
Point that when people talk transfer portal, I think a lot of this is driven specifically by Alabama in that game currently. And to your point, the thing that hurt Alabama wasn't the transfer portal, it was losing Nick Saban. The whole thing of an elite never, ever, ever losing to an unranked team hasn't been a thing. Georgia lost to probably a similarly bad South Carolina team a few years ago. This has happened for years, off and on, one-offs. But, the Alabama situation is unique because it's a new scheme. I think if Caleb Downs does not transfer to Ohio State, Alabama beats Vanderbilt. Because they needed an alley guy bad when I watched that highlight. The safeties did not play well in that game. And I think we also need to take a bit of a step back there, and I think collectively we all are, in saying, hey, Alabama's installing completely new schemes. Defensively, they lose the greatest defensive coach in football and adopt a completely new defensive scheme. And shockingly, after having lost a bunch of guys to the transfer portal, not because they were backups, but a lot of them were guys that should be starting, but simply lost their coach, they look lost, and they look like they're rebuilding. And if anything, Daniel, I will say, it almost feels like this year the pendulum's swinging back, where if you are relying on transfer players at multiple key positions, which, for example, Alabama is in the secondary, Florida State is everywhere, you may actually end up being worse as a result, because having a lack of continuity, particularly on defense, is devastating to a program. And I think we may start to see that pendulum swing back to this idea that, yeah, you may take a transfer quarterback if you don't have one, because that's the one thing where if you don't have a quarterback, you can't play, and you can take an experienced backup and make your team competent. The mass transfer, defensive roster, offensive lineman roster thing, I think that may actually tamp down, because I think people are realizing it's more valuable to have guys that spent years in your system. And having a bunch of guys at Vanderbilt that are transfers in this unique situation where they kind of stole a whole roster that actually did play together, those guys that played together for years staff are better than the 5-star transfers that have never played in the system before.
Yeah, that's the one pretty key point about Vanderbilt is they brought over. Not only do you have this transfer quarterback, but you got the system that he's played in and the coach he played for as well. So I think it's an interesting point. I do think that this is a weird year in that Bama, like I said at the top, I want to punish Alabama more than I have for losing to Vanderbilt, but I just don't see the quality behind them to put them there. Maybe Iowa State proves that, but otherwise I don't think so. I'll also add this, I think that a Tennessee or an Alabama who lost to one of these teams could turn around, like we just saw Alabama beat Georgia. I wouldn't be surprised if Alabama doesn't lose another game this year. I also wouldn't be surprised if they lose 4 games this year. We'll see, and then we'll adjust our rankings accordingly. All right, question for y'all in the comments, because AP has Penn State currently ranked ahead of Georgia. If you've made it this far, this is how you let us know. Do you think Georgia should be ranked behind Penn State, and why? Follow-up question, who do you think would win on a neutral field? All right, y'all, that's it for us on this one. Thanks so much, y'all. Have a great week, and God bless.